Well, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here, and it's good to see, hopefully, some Scottish people in the audience. Could you put your hands up if you're not BNA members? Okay, so this talk's really for you, the BNA people. There's not a lot of science in this, but there's quite a lot of politics and policy. And the BNA people can either fall asleep because it's Sunday evening and they've had a long day, or they can think of tomorrow, which I'll also be talking there tomorrow. So it's a particular pleasure to be here, because when I was invited to give this public talk, I thought, well, let's do something different for me. Let's do something challenging. And that's what I've done. So I've decided to lay out a challenge to Scotland to essentially lead what I call the Neuroscientific Enlightenment. And I'll explain what I mean by those terms as I go through my presentation. I should say I've always had a very soft spot for Scotland, particularly this spot here, the Aire of Sleat. There's the ferry going across to Mallaig, and that was where I spent my honeymoon a very long time ago. Actually, it wasn't the first time I'd been to Skye. I went to Skye when I was a student, probably about 1970, and I had made the mistake of going during Glasgow Fairs Week. Some of the Scots will understand the implications of that. And going to a ceilidh on Skye during Glasgow Fairs Week is a very interesting anthropological experience, because you see a kind of drinking which certainly didn't exist out of the border, and it didn't put me off the country, but it got me thinking about the challenges of dealing with alcohol when it's such a deep-seated, has such a deep-seated presence in society, particularly as a recreation. So just a few words to share with you who I am. I'm a psychiatrist, as I like to say with a name like Nutt. There are only a couple of careers in medicine, and the brain is a lot more interesting than venereology. I've been a researcher for about 30 years. I went into medicine to do research in the brain, and I've been fortunate to do that. I've had 4 children, and they're still with us. I've even got 2 grandchildren, interestingly. And the reason any of you are interested or know about me is because I was one of the government's drugs advisors for the last government. For 9 years, I chaired what's called the Technical Committee, the Scientific Committee of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. And working with a group of experts, some of whom are in the audience today, I tried to bring evidence-based policy to bear. And that I failed in that attempt and was eventually sacked for my efforts. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the great thing about that sacking is it propelled me into the kind of public media arena. And I discovered it's actually quite addictive. So thanks again for the invite. Yeah. So let's get back to the Enlightenment. And I want to take you back to the beginnings of modern science, which was the discovery by Copernicus that the teachings of the church relating to the position of the earth and the heavens were wrong. He worked out that, contrary to those teachings, the sun did not go around the earth. In fact, the earth went around the sun. And that was seen as a massive challenge. His followers were Giordano Bruno and the famous Galileo. Bruno was actually a very modern thinker. He actually even came up with the idea that there might be a universe beyond the solar system, and might even be many universes. And because he carried on arguing his case, they decided to burn him at the stake and return his atoms to space. Galileo worked out that Copernicus was right and was given an interesting choice, recant or die, and sensibly for his family, he recanted, but we now know he was right as well. But the important point about that was not just that science was being oppressed by the church, but that oppression lasted a long time. In 1616, the papal convocation decided to ban the writings of Copernicus. And that ban lasted for 150 years. And it was really the Enlightenment that overturned that ban. And as I shall show you in the course of this talk, some of the regulations, some of the bans we have on drugs, so-called illegal drugs, have been present now for over 50 years. And I will argue that they're more damaging to science, particularly to brain science, than was the banning of the writings of Copernicus. And that's something we need to change, and that's why we need a new Enlightenment. And this is one of my favorite authors, Voltaire, a source of many very pithy quotes, but this one essentially sums up what the Catholic Church felt about astronomy and what many people in authority feel about drugs. They feel that prejudices are what they use for reason. And he's right. When we think about drugs in the Western world today, we usually do it through the veil of prejudice. The Enlightenment was characterized by some of the greatest minds in history pulling usually in the same direction. Here are some of them. And the interesting feature, one of the key features of the Enlightenment, was the development of popular knowledge around science, as characterized by Diderot's first Encyclopedia of Science, which began to define what was out there, what was known, and made that knowledge accessible to people who could read, certainly. So what about Scotland? What's it got to do with the Enlightenment? Well, the Scots have always taken a somewhat radical view, and they were very keen to sign up to Calvinism and to take a stance against papal authority. And it's that courage to stand up against this major establishment in the Western world at the time, the Catholic Church, that led to Scotland being a powerful player in the First Enlightenment. Here are a couple of very enlightened Scottish philosophers, David Hume, Adam Smith. I don't know what you think, but I think actually David Hume looks a little bit like Alex Salmond, don't you? I mean, I've been wondering about superimposing their images. But, what Hume said, he said many great things. He said some very interesting things about the brain we haven't got time to go into today. But in relation to the discussions we're having tonight, he said a wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence. And that really should sum up, I think, our attitude to drugs and the drug laws. Adam Smith also took a much more liberal view of, and a more humane view of economics than he's often given credit for. And his view was that humans have within their own power the ability to make life better for most of us. And of course, he's right there. And there were some important features of the Scottish Enlightenment which distinguished it from the continental and the English one. They stressed the fundamental importance of human reason. And if you read Hume, you really get to the very hardest kernel of that kind of intellect. They rejected any authority that could not be justified by reason. And they had this optimistic belief in the ability of humanity to effect changes for the better, which so many of the continentals weren't so sure of. And that optimistic belief, I think, is something that I certainly cherish, and it's been something very much that I've tried to pursue in my career. It's also worth reflecting on why Scotland was so enlightened. Well, at that time, Scotland had 5 universities. We only had 2. Edinburgh University was the leading centre for medical scientific research in Europe. And I guess some of you will probably say it still is, and it's certainly up there in the top 10. And unlike in England, the Scottish intellectuals, they were not beholden to the rich and powerful. They were essentially free-thinking, independent people. And they, therefore, could be much more radical and, we would say, progressive in the way they thought about the world, thought about science, and how they could use that to improve society. But beyond that, there were some other structural features of Scotland which made its influence considerably greater than one might have expected from the size of its population and the size of its intellectual class. Because the Scottish universities were seen as extremely powerful sites of learning and education, and many people from overseas came to them to get that experience, to be anointed with the sort of Scottish educational due. But also there's enormous Scottish diaspora, particularly the USA, which spread Scottish thinking around the world. And Scotland created the English-speaking encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia Britannica was a Scottish invention in 1768. So you not only developed your independence, you started to promulgate it as well. So that was then, and now I want to move on to now and talk about where we need an enlightenment in relation to pharmacology and neuroscience, and why Scotland is well positioned to lead that. So just to reiterate what I'm talking about, when I talk about a neuroscientific enlightenment, the principles underpinning this are using neuroscience and the advances in neuroscience for the benefit of humankind, free from political and media interference. And I suppose if you want to sum up my position in relation to drugs, it would be that all drugs are equal under science, so humankind can extract maximum benefits. And that, I think, is unquestionably true scientifically, but it's not true in terms of politics and regulation. And there's a very interesting juxtaposition that occurred at the early part of the last century. The concept of drugs, the way drugs work through acting on receptors to produce an effect, came out of Edinburgh University, and the leading thinker in this field was A.J. Clarke. He developed the receptor drug effector concept, which is true and is still true to this day. But at the time he was developing that construct, the first international convention on controlling drugs was being held in The Hague. And that was a very seminal point in terms of the politics of drugs, because it was the first conference which essentially decided there were two kinds of drugs, legal and illegal drugs. And the Hague Conference started by putting controls on opioids, and later it started putting controls on cocaine and then cannabis. But it did not put controls on tobacco and alcohol. So that was the schism between drugs that are can be sold or legal and drugs which are illegal. But at that time, there was no definition of what a drug is, or any agreement, any principles on what grounds a drug should be controlled as either legal or illegal. And amazingly, 100 years on, there still aren't. There are no underpinning principles to the United Nations Conventions on Drugs. They don't define what a drug is. They don't say on what grounds the decision-making should be made. And therefore, they're completely unaccountable. And that's one of the reasons we have engaged in a war on drugs for the last 30 years, which has spent trillions of dollars, killed millions of people, and probably done considerably more harm than good. So what is a drug? Well, this is what a neuroscientist, this is what I like to say, this is why I went into neuroscience, because drugs are a great way of publishing. They make rats do things, and you can publish it. Of course, this is what the drinks industry is consistently trying to persuade us, that alcohol is not a drug. So if you say no to real drugs, you can then drink alcohol without getting in trouble. And this is such a powerful message that most people believe it. If you try this when you go home, speak to your parents, is alcohol a drug? And they'll say, what have you been taking? And then you say, is it a drug? And they'll say, no, it's not a drug. Yeah, it's something we drink socially. It helps lubricate food, etc. And then you could say to them, but come on, you take it because it changes your brain. It makes you feel better, doesn't it? And you might take too much. You might fall over. You might get a bit tipsy. You might even have a hangover the next day. Surely it's got to be a drug. And they'll look at you as if you're stupid. And they'll say, look, if it was a drug, it would be illegal. And this logic that if it's legal, it's not a drug, is an enormously powerful one that is cultivated with enormous effort through vast armies of lobbyists by the drinks industry. This is my preferred definition of a drug now, something a politician once used but now regrets. And Jackie Smith, a Home Secretary, who disagreed with my comparative harm analysis of ecstasy and horse riding, she said when asked the question, I smoked cannabis but didn't enjoy. And that's quite a challenging statement, really, for two reasons. The first is, as head of judiciary, she should have known that not enjoying is not a defense in court. Although it would be good if it was. But also, why would you do it? And of course, the answer, we think, was to get into the Labour Party in Oxford at the time, but we're not sure. And then David Cameron said, I did things when young I shouldn't have. We all did. And that we is the Eton we, otherwise known as the Tory front bench. And the great thing about David being a conservative with a small c He only did drugs which began with the letter C, and there are quite a few of those. So what I say is this: in the scientific terms, what A.J. Clarke would have said is a drug is a chemical which, when taken, produces physiological changes. And in the context of discussing regulation of drugs, when we're not talking about medicines, then we're talking about changes in the brain which are usually pleasurable, but occasionally damaging. And the drug laws are supposedly there to help regulate health, to minimize harm. But there is a peculiar lack of symmetry in the way we think about the harms of drugs. And here are two people who died as a result of using drugs. The one on the left is Gavin Britton, who died a couple of years ago now. He was at Exeter University undergraduate. He was in the golf team. And after a golf match, he engaged in a drinking game, which is sadly something that many young men in sports teams do. And he lost the first round, so the forfeit was to drink. So he drank more, and therefore he was drunk, and he lost the second round, and the forfeit was to drink more. And by the end of the third round, he'd lost his life. No one's ever heard of Gavin. He was just one of the 3 people a week who die of alcohol poisoning in this country. On the other side, there's Leah Betts. Now, how many of you, hands up, who've heard of Leah Betts? Yeah, so remarkable. You know, we're looking 30 years ago. Leah Betts dies just after her 18th birthday. She took about 80 milligrams of ecstasy under the misapprehension that if she got side effects from the drug, she should drink water. Now, drinking water as a safety measure for ecstasy is only relevant if you're dancing and sweating and getting dehydrated. All she was doing was putting together her house for her 18th birthday party, her parents' house. So she drank 7 liters of water in the course of an afternoon, and she died of water poisoning. She wouldn't have died if she hadn't drunk so much water, so her death was essentially attributable to the ignorance at the time of how you should deal with the side effects of ecstasy. But the reason you all know about her is because there was an enormous advertising campaign. That's a billboard that was stuck up on the side of the roads all over the country, warning people of the dangers of ecstasy. And that was not done by the government. That was done by the drinks industry. Because the drinks industry at that time were terrified that young people were going to stop drinking alcohol and start taking recreational drugs. And they're still terrified of that. And a great deal of the disinformation we have about new drugs, such as legal highs, is driven by the drinks industry trying to maintain their monopoly of recreational drugs. Now, the only person that you might have known, other than Leah Betts, who died of a drug overdose in this country, was Amy Winehouse. And I want to just find out exactly what you do know about her death. So I presume you've all heard of her. How many of you think she died of a drug overdose? And how many think she died of an alcohol overdose? And how many think she died of both? Yeah, okay. Well, the great thing is you're all right, because she actually died of an alcohol overdose, but alcohol is a drug. And but when she died, we all assumed she'd taken some interesting cocktail of old and new drugs. But in fact, at post-mortem, it became very clear all she had taken was alcohol. She drank about 1 liter of vodka. And the reason she died was because she was recovered. She met the current government's criteria for being cured of her alcoholism. She was clean or dry for 6 weeks. During that period of 6 weeks, she lost tolerance to the alcohol, and so a blood alcohol level of 450 milligrams %, which wouldn't normally have killed her, did kill her. And it'll kill young women of that age if they do drink 1 liter of vodka in a place of an hour or so. So she died as a result of being cured, as do many addicts. The whole concept of recovery, abstinence-based recovery, is one which has a fundamental flaw, which is if it doesn't work, you're much more likely to die. But that's a different story. The important message here is that she died of alcohol poisoning, and yet the majority of people in this country weren't told about that. They don't know about that. You're a very educated group. Most people assume she died of some other drug, and there's no incentive from the drinks industry to tell you the truth. If we look at deaths from drugs in the United Kingdom overall, we see that the biggest killer by far is still tobacco. 80,000 deaths a year, largely middle-aged to elderly people, lung disease, cancer, heart disease. Alcohol, 22,000, opiates about 1,000, paracetamol about 200. And the drugs that people get hysterical about, like ecstasy and cannabis, they kill virtually no one. They're those vanishingly small bars on the right-hand side. So in health terms, tobacco and alcohol are the biggest killers, and I will argue that alcohol is the biggest problem because it kills young people. So why do we have such an obsession about drugs like ecstasy? Well, here's a beautiful piece of work. I don't know if Alistair's in the audience. Alistair, you here? Alistair Forsyth did a PhD in Glasgow, the MRC unit, health unit there, and in the 2000s, he went back and looked at every coroner's report in Scotland in the 1990s, and you do it better. You have a better system of recording and analysing deaths in Scotland than we have in England and Wales. So he went through every death and found all those in which a drug other than alcohol was present at the time of death. And then he went through every newspaper to see whether those deaths were reported. And he discovered there were 2,255 deaths, of which about 1 in 4 were reported in the newspapers. But there was a very significant bias in reporting. So, for instance, only 1 of the 265 paracetamol deaths were reported. That was 1 in 72 of the morphine deaths. Rare deaths, like amphetamines, were much more likely to be reported. 1 in 3 of those few amphetamine deaths were reported. And then you look at cocaine, 1 in 8, heroin, 1 in 5, methadone, 1 in 16. But the drug that always got reported was ecstasy. So the reason people are concerned about death from ecstasy is not that ecstasy is killing many people, but every death is reported, usually with a very big picture of a very attractive young person. And that distortion is then ammunition for policymakers to continue with policies of focusing on ecstasy and ignoring alcohol. Now, one of the things I did achieve when I was working for the Home Office was to develop a systematic way of assessing the harms of drugs. And this was a long process using many experts. But we came eventually to the conclusions there are 16 ways in which drugs can harm you. There are harms to the users, 9 of those, and there are 7 harms to others. And using those 16 harms, we then assessed the relative harms of 20 drugs using a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis, which I won't go into now. But at the end of all that, we came up with this graph. And to our surprise, the drug causing the most harm in the UK was alcohol. And the reason it's got the tallest bar there is because of the scale of the red bar. The red bar is a representation of our estimate of the social harms, the relative social harms of alcohol, which are enormous. The blue bars are the harms to the user. It's not the most dangerous drug. The most dangerous drug to the user is crack, followed by heroin and crystal meth. But the social harms of alcohol are so vast that alcohol is the most harmful drug in the UK. And I just want to remind you of some of those. So here's an interesting statistic I pulled out for you living north of the border. 1/3 of all homicides in Britain are committed by people, in Scotland, are committed by people who are drunk when they're accused. Drugs, about 5%, and both about 3%. So an enormous overrepresentation of this drug in relation to murder. It also ruins careers. We all have colleagues whose careers have been destroyed by alcohol. Now here's one of the more talented MPs, a man who had actually worked outside of the Westminster bubble before he went in, but drunk in a bar in Parliament one night, he nutted a Conservative MP and no longer is there. Here's another sad story. One of the great achievements of Scottish science was the first cloning from a somatic cell line of a mammal, Dolly the sheep. Absolutely a remarkable achievement. Wilmot and Campbell were the lead scientists. Campbell's now dead. He's dead because he was drunk, angry, and acted out in relationship to a row he was having with his girlfriend and hung himself. And Campbell's death's interesting. When you read what was said about him, he was a regular drinker, which I think is a euphemism probably for an alcoholic, who suffered from hypertension, high blood pressure, and a heart condition, all of which are well-known sequelae from being an alcoholic. So there you have it. A man who potentially could have got the Nobel Prize died as a result of his drinking. And many people die from alcohol. Alcohol is now the leading cause of death in men in the UK under the age of 50. And in the next decade, it'll be the leading cause of death in women as well, because women are drinking more. So this is, I would say, a major public health problem, because young people dying is a very, very wasteful experience. Here's another chilling graph. This graph covers my period in medicine. I started in medicine in 1971, when they first started collecting data. These are data that look at what are called standardized mortality rates. The likelihood of any of you dying of a disorder of the brain, the heart, the liver, the endocrine organs, the chest, etc. And those data are collected so we can estimate how well we're doing in terms of healthcare provision. And you'll see over the 40 years that those data have been collected, all the different colored lines have gone down, with the exception of the red line. So in all the disease systems I've just mentioned, with the exception of the liver, mortality has dropped, sometimes to a third of what it was in 1971. And there are two reasons for that. One is that society is healthier, and the second is that medicine is better. So isn't it weird that liver deaths have gone in exactly the opposite direction? And liver disease, deaths from liver disease have gone up 5 times, whereas deaths from heart disease have gone down 50%. And 80% of that rise in liver deaths is due to alcohol. So we have created a tidal wave of deaths from alcoholic liver disease, driven largely by our blind pursuance of policies which are essentially dictated by the drinks industry. And of course, Scotland, unfortunately, is worse than any other country. In fact, you have the worst rates of liver disease in the world. The Russians die faster from alcohol because they drink so much they don't even get liver disease. But you get liver disease, and you get liver disease at a rate which is chilling, and that's why you have to do something about it, because that is driven by alcohol. We know that in Scotland, alcohol dependency reduces life expectancy by about 15 years. And 40% of your intensive care beds are occupied by people who are suffering from an alcohol-related illness. So it's an enormous social cost. And it's also enormous personal cost to those people who have to look after the individuals with this illness. About once a week, I get a comment from a journalist telling me about another paper which showed that cannabis changes the brain or crystal meth changes the brain. What do I think of that? And each time I draw their attention to the fact that we've known for 100 years that the only drug that actually changes and damages the brain is alcohol. These are 4 scans from 4 of my patients in an MRC trial we're doing, trying to look for treatments to stop alcoholics relapsing. So these are abstinent alcoholics, the bottom 4, desperately trying not to relapse. The top 4 are age and sex match control brains. And you don't have to be a radiologist to see that the top brains are very different from the bottom brains. The bottom brains are much more shrunken, they've got much more fluid in them. Some of those bottom brains are more damaged than the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, I would argue that alcohol is probably the most tractable target for intervention in dementia we have, because at least we know it causes it. So alcohol is the most damaging drug to the brain. However, you're doing something about it. And that's why I was pleased to come here and give this lecture, because I'm really thrilled by what Scotland's doing. Scotland's bringing in minimum alcohol pricing. It's decreased the drink driving limit. It's stopped bulk purchase discounts. And these are all proven interventions that countries like France and some Canadian states have introduced with good effect. Now, you haven't managed to get minimum pricing through the European courts yet. Hopefully you will, but because it's going to be a useful addition to the way in which we reduce alcohol damage. And I want to explain why that is. Because one of the problems with alcohol is that the relationship between consumption and harm is curvilinear, exponential. The more you drink, the much more harm you get, particularly if you're a man, the red bars. So if you're drinking 100 grams of alcohol a day, a bottle of wine a day, your likelihood of dying of an alcohol-related disorder is about 18 times that if you're drinking 10 grams a day. But if you reduce your consumption from 100 grams a day to 50 grams a day, you reduce the risk 8 times. So there's a massive gain in any kind of reduction in consumption. And that's why minimum pricing works. Because we think that minimum pricing of 50 pence a litre would lead to about a 10% reduction in consumption. But that will occur at two ends. It'll occur at the young people starting to drink, and it'll occur in individuals who are heavily dependent, the ones who are clogging up hospitals and intensive care units. And a 10% reduction in consumption at the high end will lead to about a 30% reduction in harms. And that translates into very significant public health gains. So that would save about 30 deaths a year, reduce hospital admissions by 4,000 a year, reduce crime volumes by about 3,500 offences a year, and save about nearly £1 billion over 10 years. So this is an enormously sensible and powerful approach. And it's outrageous that the drinks industry are taking this sensible health policy right to the European Court in an attempt to block your government bringing it through. And it's outrageous that my government has done a complete U-turn on this under pressure from the drinks industry. And we have this fundamental problem in Britain, in England, in Wales, or certainly in England, that the media are largely fueled by the drinks industry. Journalists will write essentially whatever the drinks industry tell them if they give them enough to drink over lunch. And every time we have a discussion about controlling alcohol, we get articles saying, this is a nanny state, you're punishing the responsible drinker, etc. And these are lies. And I did manage a little while ago to get an article in The Spectator pointing out the falsehoods there. The truth is that the responsible drinker would actually save money with minimum pricing because they are not drinking to the point where they harm themselves. But if we reduce other people harming themselves, then we will save tax expenditure on health. And I estimated that the average responsible drinker would save £150 a year if we had minimum pricing. And if they were a higher rate taxpayer, they'd save even more. So the evidence is that everyone wins. And that message should be really shouted loud and clear. You've also brought in a much more rational approach to drink driving. You actually just reduced the drink driving level from 80 to 50. It doesn't seem like a lot, it's a 38% reduction, but it will reduce road traffic accidents by at least a half. Again, because of this exponential relationship between alcohol levels and in the blood and accidents. So this is a really important gain, and one we would like to see translated into the England and Wales as well. But now I want to move on to slightly more controversial areas, and I want to talk about cannabis first. There's Alan Johnson, the man that sacked me. I'm one of those people in that spliff in there. Here you go. You can see my moustache there. Cannabis is probably the oldest medicine in the world. People have found evidence of it being used in China 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and in Egypt as well. It was legal as a medicine in the UK to 1971, when it was banned because a couple of GPs in London started prescribing it for people to use recreationally. And for party political reasons, the government of the day decided rather than just ban the doctors, it would ban the drug to show it was being hard on drugs. And this has really been very hard on the people who would benefit from medical cannabis, people like Queen Victoria. Now, she used cannabis regularly to deal with period pains and the pains of childbirth. And sometimes I think that maybe the reason she had so many children was that she might have used it at other times as well, when she was reclining on the moors at Balmoral. As far as I know, it was never busted. Now, the hysteria about cannabis has come in the face of massive increase in use. Here we go back to 1970, when about 500,000 people in the United Kingdom have ever tried cannabis. And you can see that inexorable rise in use to the point where about 10 million people have used. And if you go into populations like university students, it's more like up to about 80% of students have used cannabis. Now, that massive increase in use of cannabis, you might imagine would have caused health problems if it was anything like as harmful as alcohol. However, as I showed you, there's almost no deaths. So why is cannabis illegal? Well, the true answer is because we wanted to help the Americans keep cannabis illegal. That was one of their main goals until a couple of years ago, so we appeased them. But how can we justify cannabis being illegal? Well, we came up with three arguments. One was skunk, one was driving, and one was schizophrenia. And I just want to demolish each of those in turn. So skunk is a strong THC-dominant form of cannabis, which has largely been driven by the prohibition or the making access of herbal cannabis much more difficult. And it's homegrown, hydroponics, lights, and therefore people tend to grow the strongest version possible, more bang for your buck. We have seen some ridiculous claims about skunk. We've had famous doctors saying it's 100 times more potent than hash. We've had other so-called neuroscientists say one spliff kills 1 million cells in the hippocampus. And others saying it's a leading cause of schizophrenia. And we've even had a Scotsman called Gordon Brown saying skunk is lethal. I don't know, is lethal a Scottish word for intoxicating? I'm not sure what that means. Certainly skunk doesn't kill you. The reality of skunk is about 15% THC. Hash is about 5 to 6%. So the relationship between skunk and hash is about the same as between wine and ordinary beer. So it's not so different that people couldn't possibly moderate their use. Perhaps more importantly is the fact that growing skunk to maximize the THC content inevitably reduces the levels of this other substance called cannabidiol. And cannabidiol may have some protective effects against the active stoning ingredient THC. It may reduce anxiety, it may reduce paranoia. So we may have actually created a version of cannabis which is actually less pleasant and more dangerous potentially. But as far as we know, most users self-regulate, unless they're in experiments done by Professor Curran. What about cannabis in driving? Well, here's some data from the government's own report, which it rapidly dismissed after it was published last year, showing that the odds ratio of an accident if you've got cannabis present in your body is 2, alcohol is 8, and 2 together it's about 15. So these are data collected around the world. Cannabis is much less damaging to driving than alcohol. And in fact, where we have seen the liberalization of access to cannabis, such as in the USA, we're seeing a fall in alcohol-related deaths on the road because a significant proportion of people switch from being drunk to being stoned. And when they're stoned, they don't want to drive, and if they do drive, they drive much more carefully. And the other really important point, and that's a bottom line here, just to reflect on this, there's also been a very significant fall in the number of deaths from prescription opioids in states where cannabis is available for pain control. Because cannabis doesn't kill you an overdose, which is one of the reasons it scores lower on the scales of harm. Now, what about schizophrenia? Well, this is the last vestige of a reason that the government clung to in terms of trying to keep cannabis under control and making it actually more harshly controlled, moving it to Class B. And you might imagine that a 20-fold increase in cannabis use over the space of 40 years would have led to a significant increase in schizophrenia. Well, we thought that would be testable. We went to the MRC GP database and looked at the incidence and prevalence of schizophrenia and psychosis over the period when that big rise in cannabis use would have expected to have translated into an increase in these disorders. And in fact, you can see there's no increase. If anything, schizophrenia is falling. Nowhere in the Western world has the increase in cannabis use translated into schizophrenia. And there's only one piece of data which goes back to 1958, the Swedish conscript study, which actually can talk about the risk. And if you take that data at face value, which we did, we said that to prevent one case of schizophrenia, you've got to stop 5,000 young men and 7,000 young women from ever smoking cannabis. Now, that is not a tractable public health approach. The investment in preventing that much cannabis use, those number of people using cannabis, is just not worth the gains in terms of schizophrenia. This is a myth. And I want to reflect on the problem of the myth of schizophrenia and cannabis from the eyes of, or from the words of Charles Darwin. who said, "False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long." Now, Darwin wasn't Scottish, but he did spend his formative years here in Edinburgh University reflecting on some of the interesting perspectives that the scientists here had on in terms of biology and zoology. And there's a very interesting book you can see there, Darwin in Scotland, as the mankind evolves to carry the salt air. But beyond Darwin, you do have a very eminent cannabis expert. I don't know if he's in the audience, is he? No? But Roger Pertwee and his group at Aberdeen University are the people who have done almost more than anyone else in the world to discover the different components of the cannabis plant. They've identified over 100 different elements of the plant, each of which could potentially have significant therapeutic potential. Have they been able to develop any? No. Because the regulations in this country are so oppressive, cannabis is treated as more dangerous than heroin by the current regulations, that they haven't been able to turn any of their inventions into medicines. And most of the work now is being done in Israel and now in the USA. Wasted opportunity simply in this failed attempt to stop young people using cannabis, because the rules that stop them having access to it are applied very vigorously when scientists want to use it for research. So, one of the campaigns I have started recently is a campaign to put cannabis back into the pharmacopoeia, make it a medicine again. And that's something I think Scotland can do. You have your own health system, you should campaign to be allowed to do this. Now, arguing about cannabis was what got me sacked. Here you see the book of Cannabis falling from my hand as Alan Johnson shuts me up and drags me off the podium. At the time, I was rather alone, or not. Certainly, there weren't many people speaking publicly about the comparative harms of cannabis and other drugs. But I now know I'm right, because the most important man in the world has said so. Here's Obama last year saying that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. And this was a hugely important statement, the first time an American president had ever told the truth about drugs. And he had to do it. He had to do it to stop civil war in his country, because now about 200 million Americans have access to medical cannabis, even though the drug is illegal under the federal law. And he had to intervene to stop the feds, the DEA, destroying pharmacists which were supplying medical cannabis to these 200 million people. And he said, no, we won't do that, because cannabis is not sufficiently harmful to warrant that kind of oppressive intervention. So effectively, cannabis is now medically available in the States to most people, 2/3 of the population. And of course, it's legal recreationally in about 6 states, including Washington, D.C. So you can smoke cannabis on the steps of the Capitol now. And I would suggest to Scotland that you might take some note of what happened just across the water in the Netherlands. 30 years ago, the Dutch decided to have a rational approach to cannabis. They set up the coffee shops to stop their young people having to go to dealers and being given heroin when they wanted cannabis. They had a remarkable effect to separate the markets, but it's also had a very beneficial effect in terms of medical cannabis, and also the benefits of coffee shops in terms of tourism. And I think if Scotland went down the route of the Netherlands, a lot of benefits would accrue. You'd have medical tourism. People would come from England to get medical cannabis. They'd come in their tens of thousands. You'd have cannabis tourism. It's easier to get here than it is to get to the Netherlands. You'd have a lot less weekend violence in your town centres. It's a pleasure to walk around Amsterdam on a Friday or Saturday night. It's not a pleasure to walk around most British cities. You'd have a reduced use of prescription opioids. You'd have more pharmaceutical investment, and you'd have fewer alcohol road deaths. This would be an enormously sensible policy to introduce. What about other drugs? Well, another very, very famous and eminent pharmacologist was Hans Kostelitz, a refugee from Hungary, settled in Aberdeen, and was the man that discovered the morphine receptors in the brain. And from that work and understanding the structure activity of opiates, very important treatments such as Subutex were developed. So he has been a particularly influential pillar in terms of the treatment of addiction. And then there's John Gade, one of the founding fathers of the British Pharmacological Society, one of the leading pharmacologists of his generation, who felt obliged to take LSD himself in his laboratory to understand what the role of the serotonin receptors that LSD worked on did in the brain. He lived to tell the tale, and we now know that LSD was actually quite widely used by scientists in the 1950s and early 60s before it was made illegal. Here are two Nobel Prize winners. In fact, these are the two most important Nobel Prize winners in life sciences ever. Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix, and Kary Mullis. And after Francis Crick had discovered the double helix, he then went on to work out how proteins were made, and when he discovered that with Sanger, he then decided to work out how the brain worked. And the reason he started to work out how the brain worked was because he started taking LSD and got interested in the altered behavior of his brain under LSD. Unfortunately, the police in Cambridge at the time weren't very comfortable with him having parties so close to the students that they started to put pressure on him to stop his self-experimentation. And so he left. He left this country. He went to the States where he lived for the rest of his life because he wasn't allowed to essentially develop his own insights into brain science because of the laws here. And Kary Mullis is the man that gave you PCR. The PCR is what you use to find out whether your beef burger is actually a horse burger. It's a fundamental technique in the whole of biology now. And Kary Mullis saw the PCR as he was driving down the San Diego highway. He saw DNA unraveling during an LSD trip. And he was a great protagonist of the use of LSD to broaden the mind of scientists so that they could perhaps conquer problems that they couldn't get insights into otherwise. And I don't know if you knew about this quote, but I'm going to give you this quote from Einstein, which I think rather sums it up. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And there's one thing that certainly Kary Mullis would say was that consciousness is different under LSD. In fact, it's so different that when LSD was discovered, it was immediately seen as a hugely valuable tool for scientific research. It was made a medicine. It was called Delicid. Sandow gave it out to doctors and scientists around the world. There were about 1,000 clinical papers published on it in the 1950s and 60s, 40 books, 6 international conferences. And the results were overwhelmingly positive in describing safe and effective treatments. This is a very masterly summary by Masters and Houston. And here's an example of a recent meta-analysis of the 6 controlled trials of LSD and alcoholism. And it shows that the effect size, the efficacy of LSD to treat alcoholism is as good as anything we have today. But the drug was banned in 1967, and there have been no studies since. In fact, there's only been 3 studies on LSD in the last 40 years. And I ask you, why would you deny patients with this debilitating disorder of alcoholism access to a treatment which might help them? Simply to stop young people, or to try to stop young people using this drug recreationally. Why would you want to do that? Well, the reason LSD got banned is tied up with the political circumstances around the Vietnam War. And young Americans decided it was actually much nicer to go to San Francisco and take acid, or to drop acid, than it was to go to Vietnam and drop bombs. And that challenged the American way of life and the American philosophy of life so much that they had to get the drug banned. And they then created a whole series of scare stories to justify banning the drug. And some of these stories were truly remarkable. Girl gives birth to a frog after taking LSD. But these were so outrageous, you laugh. And of course you should laugh, but the point is the drug laws don't have to be based on true evidence. They can be based on public perception. And this is enough to get the public concerned, and therefore LSD got banned. And it got banned in the face of questioning from the most powerful man in the world, the man who would have been president, the Secretary of State at the time, Bobby Kennedy, who said, why, if the trials of LSD were worthwhile 6 months ago, why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep on going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? I think perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that LSD can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. So even he couldn't stop the Drug Enforcement Agency and the CIA banning a drug based on lies. And I would say, has there ever been a worse example of research censorship? And I showed you possibly the only other comparable one, which is the banning the works of Copernicus. But for the last 45 years, scientists have not been able to study these drugs because politicians, regulators, do not want us to study these drugs. Not even Scotland's answer to Timothy Leary. R.D. Laing, I don't know, you're still claiming him as a Scot. I mean, maybe he's not. Maybe he's been excommunicated, I don't know. But Laing was one of the most influential psychiatrists in the history of British psychiatry. And he famously said, if you want to become a psychoanalyst, do three things. Read the works of Freud, undergo personal analysis, and take LSD. Maybe that's why you kicked him out, I don't know. But he did end up in London. Here's how illegality affects science. This is magic mushroom juice, psilocybin. The man that discovered LSD, Hoffman, discovered psilocybin in 1957, the structure. Massive explosion of research. People then, the regulators say, oh, hang on, this looks like LSD, ban it. And as soon as it's made illegal, there's an enormous fall-off in research, and it's only just beginning to be resurrected today. And the truth is that many, many banned drugs have potential as treatments. Cannabis for pain, spasticity, cancer, ecstasy for PTSD, Parkinson's disease, psilocybin for depression, OCD, LSD for terminal illness, addiction. Many of these drugs have therapeutic utility, but current regulations make them almost impossible to research. Whether these laws actually stop young people using them is moot, but they certainly stop scientists working with them. And if you want to read more about it, here's a freebie you can get on open access from PLOS Biology I wrote a couple of weeks ago. But this 50-year-old impediment to research is absolutely outrageous. And it's something we as scientists and you as the general public who are being denied access to therapeutics by these irrational regulations should be doing something about. And that's what I want to finish with. I want Scotland perhaps to be enlightened and lead us to a new future. You should build on your alcohol harm reduction model. You should ban alcohol advertising. The French did it 30 years ago. They've subsequently won the World Cup in soccer, and they got to the final of the World Cup in rugby. You do not need alcohol to have a decent national sports team. Restrict bar opening times. Limit off sales. Almost all the increased consumption of alcohol, which has led to this massive rise in liver deaths, is due to people buying alcohol in supermarkets. And you could progress other drugs the same way. You could have safer tobacco products. You could liberalize access to cannabis. And you should reduce and remove restrictions on research. Scotland could go from this, from drinking Bucky beer or Bucky wine and kicking people's faces in, to keep calm and smoking weed and having coffee shops in the streets of Edinburgh. That would bring a lot of, as I say, a lot of tourism to this country. You can improve the safety of nicotine products. Here's another analysis we did recently comparing cigarettes, which are the biggest bar, the vastly more harmful than snus, and e-cigarettes. And some of you may not know what snus is, but snus is something that your Scandinavian colleagues, your close genetic relatives in Norway and Sweden have developed a safe way of using tobacco. It doesn't increase lung cancer, it doesn't increase heart disease, it has major health benefits. Unfortunately, it's illegal in Europe because it contravenes the trade arrangement with tobacco industry to sell cigarettes. But why shouldn't you change the laws, just like you're going to change the law in relation to alcohol? Make MDMA a medicine. It was a medicine. It was a medicine. When it was a medicine, it was called empathy. And then someone had the wise, rather sad idea of selling it as ecstasy to young people. And there's nothing politicians and journalists hate more than young people having ecstasy, because it makes them remember what they've missed all these years. And so it got banned. But it was a medicine, and it should be a medicine. There's no reason why the Scottish Medicines Group couldn't say, it is a medicine, let Scottish psychiatrists use it. And then finally, I want to just talk about my own particular target at present, which is using the power of neuroscience to make a safe alcohol. Almost all my professional career, I have been trying to work out ways of stopping people dying from drinking. And I've realized it's not going to be possible. There's an intrinsic toxicity to alcohol, which is why we use it to clean the skin and pickle fruit, etc. It kills bugs, but also it's metabolized to acetaldehyde, so it inevitably produces a toxin in the body. And about 10 years ago, I thought the only way out of this terrible bind was to find a safer alcohol. Now, within the compass of modern neuroscience, we can do that. We can find compounds which give you the same kind of intoxicating effect as alcohol, but which will not damage your brain or your liver or your heart. And in some cases, we could give you an antidote to sober up so you could drive home safely. It's there. We just have to invest in it. Given the fact that alcohol now kills about 4 million people worldwide, this will be an enormous, enormous gain. This would save more lives in curing malaria, tuberculosis, meningitis, and dengue fever. And we've got the technology. Why don't we use the technology? The reason is that people who would invest in this say, well, hang on a sec, are these drugs legal? And I say, of course they're legal, I'm not that stupid. And they say, okay, but will they stay legal? And that's a really good question. And unless we have rational drug laws, they might not, because the Sun might tell us that they cause people to go mad. And so we have to have an enlightened view about drugs in order to develop safer alternatives. However, I'm kind of pleased that at least it's getting into the public domain through cartoons. This is a cartoon in the Times a couple of years ago. Professor Nutt would not invent these medicines. I particularly like the right-hand one. You'll like this one, Cameron's Absinthe. Too toxic to be drunk without a dose of Clegg. But I thought that actually, there's a bit of a problem with that cartoon, and it misses out this new party, the Scottish National Party, which in the end is going to determine what happens in the Westminster Parliament, isn't it? So I decided we ought to have a Scottish drink, and I'm calling it Snaps. This will be a synthetic alcohol for nationalists. It's caffeine-free, mixes well with iron brew. And maybe I could get a Scottish investor to develop it with me. And this is my last slide and my final word. Now, John Stuart Mill was a great thinker of the Enlightenment. He wasn't Scottish, but he did spend 3 years as rector of St Andrews University. He came there presumably because it was one of the great seats of learning in the country. And this is this fundamental comment that he made in the middle there. In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be made criminal unless it's harmful to others. Now, when I started working for the government 10 years ago, I assumed that our laws and our regulations were built on that premise, because it's such a widely known and widely quoted one. I discovered to my horror over the years that it's irrelevant. There are no principles underpinning any of the decisions that are made currently in the UK government. But this should be the underpinning principle, and we should champion that. But I particularly like this other quote, and I think this is a great quote because I think this is Scotland, isn't it? In this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom, is in itself a service. Well, go for it, Scotland, because that's what you've been good at doing for these centuries. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, we have some time for some questions from the audience. And so I'll get the mics in. First one down here. So if you just raise your hand, we'll get the mics before you need to answer the questions. If you could keep them to questions and just one straightforward, simple question, that would be a real help. Thank you. So if we'd have the first question.
In terms of the risk of developing schizophrenia, particularly in people who are already at high risk, do you think that any drugs, including alcohol, cannabis, hallucinogens, actually play a role?
It's not impossible that they might. I mean, certainly there are case reports of individuals having psychotic episodes precipitated by psychedelics. So I certainly wouldn't encourage people with that propensity or genetic or family vulnerability to take drugs. But it's going to be a small fraction of the total proportion of people with schizophrenia. And it's not a particularly useful approach to dealing with schizophrenia. And what's worse is that it's a distraction. And the whole cannabis schizophrenia argument, I find very disturbing, because when I talk to my patients with schizophrenia and ask them why they smoke cannabis, even though it makes the voices louder, they say, yeah, but for the first time, I don't feel locked into obsessing about them. I can relax, I can sleep. My body is less tense from the side effects of my medication. So we need to understand why people use cannabis, why schizophrenics use cannabis, because they're using it because our medicines aren't very good. And it's almost certainly not a particular problem for them. It's a problem for psychiatrists who only are interested in how loud the voices are. It's not such a problem for our patients.
Great, there's another question here.
Have you spoken to any health policy people in Scottish Government?
I haven't. I did have some of you may not know this, but the SNP did try, as a minority government, to bring through the minimum pricing a few years ago. And I did have a conversation with one of the advisors to the government there. I did offer my services. It wasn't taken up. And I think they probably thought you didn't need it because you were going to get into power. As you got into power, you now got the law, but you still need it in Europe. And I'd be more than happy to assist anyone in Scotland to progress these kind of topics.
Question here, third one.
Hi. When you present mortality rates in your slides in the media, why do you choose to present absolute values and not as a percentage of users? As it's just an easy criticism to level at you, I think.
No, it's not. You see, the point is, what are we trying to do by telling people about the harms of drugs? We're trying to do a number of different things. But if we're trying to guide government policy, we need to know about the total numbers, because that's where the burden of healthcare is. But yes, you could certainly change or adjust the metric to take into account of the number of users. That's not so difficult to do. But even if you do that, the graph doesn't shift enormously.
Some ones at the front here.
Yep. David, you're absolutely right to celebrate the Scottish Government's action on alcohol in terms of promoting evidence-based policies on price availability and marketing. They're far away from that in relation to drug policy. I don't know how you think that can change.
Well, I'm just hoping that I could flatter you into the fact having made the evidence-based decision on alcohol, why not use that knowledge base to broaden to other drugs? It makes perfect sense. I've given you enough arguments to think about it at the very least. Why it wouldn't change? Well, that would be presumably because you're not as enlightened as I hope you are.
Next question over here.
Do you think acid could be used to help empathy disorders such as autism?
Well, LSD for autism, yeah, that's quite a big ask. I'm not sure about that. I think possibly not. But what I am particularly interested in is a trial that started now of MDMA for autism. There's a small trial, sort of pilot study of MDMA for autism, hoping to increase empathy in those patients. That started in America. We should know the results of that in the next year or so. I think LSD's got more utility in relation to addiction and also end of life, helping people come to terms with dying and seeing that there's more to death than just not being here.
Great. I think there's one in the front here.
How can you reliably assess the mortality rates when in the UK if it's not equally accessible? So you cite alcohol quite a lot, but obviously the accessibility is far greater than, for instance, cannabis.
Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, certainly, anyone can smoke cannabis who want. I mean, cannabis is not difficult to get. We know that, as I say, up to 60% of some populations have smoked cannabis at some point in their life. But you're right, the lifetime consumption of cannabis is less than alcohol. And that's actually a good thing. I mean, I think cannabis is it's more self-limiting than alcohol because it's not as addictive as alcohol. And because actually, interestingly, it makes a lot of people paranoid and they don't like that, so they stop smoking. So there's a sort of intrinsic barrier to continuing to smoke cannabis in many people. But if you can do it, and we've thought about this, getting a metric of say what the risk is from a single use or a month's use. I'm working on the idea, perhaps, of comparing everything to a litre of vodka. I'm working with some statisticians and epidemiologists. Maybe that might be something that you could all understand. You know, a litre of vodka will probably kill about a quarter of you. That gives you, so you don't want to do that. So how can we scale everything, other drug uses to that? That might be a useful way of doing it.
This gentleman here.
Yep. Professor Nutt, first of all, I'd like to thank you for standing up for your beliefs. It's still a rare thing in our times. In your talk, you focused quite a bit on the impact and the engagement of the alcohol industry in regulation of drugs. However, you did not mention that I noticed the drug industry's engagement, which could also be quite important for the Scottish scientific output.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue. I mean, some people feel very strongly that the pharmaceutical industry is also anti-innovation with novel drugs. That's not entirely true. So in fact, one illegal drug which is undergoing a new kind of experience or target in treatment is ketamine, which has been around as an anesthetic and an analgesic for a while. Now it's being used as a treatment for depression. Even though it's illegal, pharmaceutical companies are trying to develop safer versions, like the S-enantiomer of ketamine. Talk about that tomorrow afternoon if you're in the meeting. So the pharmaceutical companies they're not absolutely against it. They're not very, but the truth is, when a drug's illegal, working in the illegal space increases costs at least tenfold. So in fact, the S-ketamine development is being done essentially as a charitable gesture by Johnson & Johnson, because they won't make any money because of the extra cost. So if we could get drugs out of that space, out of the regulatory controls, out of the Schedule 1, then I think companies would get very interested, as they are in the US at present with cannabis.
This one here, number 2.
Yeah. In terms of memory loss, what's your take on that? Memory loss with cannabis use?
Well, certainly being stoned all the time isn't good for your memory. So being stoned is bad for memory, just like being drunk is not good for memory. Actually, being intoxicated with most drugs isn't good for memory. The only exceptions are the psychedelics and MDMA, which don't affect memory. In the long term, though, there's not much evidence that long-term cannabis use leads to significant memory problems. And I'm hesitant here. I'm just looking at Professor Curran to make sure she's going to nod. Yeah, okay, good. But ketamine is bad in the long term for memory. So that's one of the problems of long-term ketamine use. It does impact your memory.
Okay, one at the back there.
Well, thanks, Dave. Since many psychoactive drugs have been banned, there's been huge progress in neuroimaging technologies. So how much of the drugs laws held back our understanding of how these drugs have an effect on the brain in terms of these new neuroimaging technologies?
Oh, totally. I mean, there's almost no science, there's no human neuroscience of many of these drugs. So, for instance, we conducted the first ever imaging study of psilocybin in the brain. We've conducted the first UK study of MDMA in the brain. We've just finished the first ever study worldwide of LSD in the brain. But doing those, it's just enormously difficult because of the regulations. It takes 5 to 10 times longer to get permissions. It costs 5 to 10 times more than it should. And yet the results, what we've seen so far, particularly with psilocybin and MDMA, are remarkable. Again, you can go to the session tomorrow, which some of this data is being presented. They've opened up a whole new area of neuroscience. And it's a real pity we had to wait 40 years to do it, or 30, it's enormous wasted opportunities.
Now, if I may, can I ask one last question, because then I think we have to round out. And that is to say, in the past, if we have a complete ban on something, it's almost counterproductive. So how far would you go towards a complete ban of alcohol to get the maximum effect of reducing what you would see as one of the most harmful drugs?
No, that would be. I wouldn't go for a complete ban. I mean, it was tried in the US. It was tried in Norway and Sweden, and with the temperance movements and prohibition, and it led to an enormous amount of organised crime. It created organised crime. I think the models are the French model, which is where which reduced the sale of cheap alcohol, stop alcohol advertising, reduce the drink driving limit. That. You may not have, I didn't have time to show you on the graphs, but when I started in medicine, the French death rates from cirrhosis were 10 times ours. Now, the Scottish death rates from cirrhosis are 4 times those of France. France has transformed its approach by those 3 simple measures. And the greatest thing of all is that the French drinks industry is more profitable now than it was before, because there is more profit in expensive alcohol. So all the cheap wine producers have moved into producing quality wine. And the British drinks industry know that. They know that actually they would be probably better off if they stopped selling 8% industrial alcohol and malic acid mixtures called cider. And they did proper brewed drinks that were properly taxed. But they just can't be bothered to change their model of marketing. So they oppose any progressive developments in relation to alcohol because it's just so easy to make money doing what they're doing at present. It's easier to lie about the harms of alcohol than it is to change their policy. But those are proven policies which should be brought in, and they would work.
Well, look, as John Stuart Mill said, we shouldn't bend the knee to custom. And I think we have seen time and time again, Professor David Nutt is one of those people who doesn't bend the knee to custom, and we very much welcome his evidence-based led arguments, and it's challenging to us and to politicians. So I'd like you all very much to show our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you.